Hi, my name's Tom and today I'll be talking with you about virtue ethics. Before we begin, let's have a look at this little cartoon. So there's a samurai and a student sitting next to him, and the samurai says, "Of the 7 virtues of the samurai, the greatest is a devotion to all things samurai. I could never be bothered learning the other 6 virtues." So what is virtue ethics? In virtue ethics, we judge actions by how they portray virtues, rather than by the outcomes to the action or absolute moral rules regarding that action. In this sense, virtue ethics is a character-centered ethical system. Virtue ethicists hold that we should aim to be virtuous by adhering to given virtues about a golden mean. Let's take the example of the virtue of courage. We should not be too foolhardy or cowardly, as both of these extremes are vices, but instead we should try to find some midpoint, a golden mean of courage. To put this in a real-life scenario, consider the example of a firefighter. If the firefighter is foolhardy in not putting on protective equipment and rushing into the fire, they are not acting in a courageous fashion, and therefore this is a vice. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if the firefighter refuses to go in to save people from the fire, they are acting in a cowardly fashion, and this is also a vice. The great advantage of virtue ethics is that it's a holistic approach and it considers emotions, motivations, and is highly individualistic and adaptable to various contexts and persons. However, it is these advantages which lead to unclear action guidance and various ambiguities. There is also disagreement on what the virtues are or which are the most important. Another complaint is that these virtues seem to be relativistic. Different societies at different times seem to place different amounts of value on different virtues. A study of virtue ethics would not be complete without considering Aristotle and Plato, the forerunners of this ethical theory. They believed that the ultimate goal of humans was to achieve eudaimonia, or human flourishing. Therefore, virtues should be those which increase human flourishing. They also said that we should practice arete, in other words, be as best as we could for our potential, and in doing so we would learn phronesis, or moral wisdom or knowledge. In this sense, becoming a virtuous person is a learning process and something which is developed over time. Aristotle and Plato also helped to develop what have been known as the cardinal virtues. These virtues are prudence, which is to have good judgment of all things moral; justice, which is to treat people equally and fairly; temperance, which is to practice self-control and moderation; and fortitude, or courage. Now let's consider virtue ethics in practice. Let's first consider the example of deception. If a child asked a parent, "Is grandpa going to die?" and let's say that grandpa is in hospital and has a fairly grim medical situation, it might not be immoral for a parent to say grandpa is fine, seeing that this is a sort of midpoint between completely lying and completely telling the truth. There is some ambiguity here in this situation. But even if it was quite likely that grandpa will die, it would probably be immoral to be overtly truthful and say, yes, definitely grandpa is going to die, as this would be being too truthful. Let's now consider the example of suicide. If someone kills themselves in a selfish way, perhaps to escape commitments or responsibility for their actions, then it might be immoral. But if it was done in a selfless way, for example, as a sacrifice to save someone else, then you could probably argue that it was moral. However, finding a golden mean for an action like suicide is quite difficult because suicide is absolute. You either have committed suicide or you have not. There's no real grey area or mean that you could probably come to there. However, there is a mean in, say, the motivations. Let's look at another example, say, of laziness. If this laziness was tempered by hard work, then you might say that on average the person is being moral because they're not being lazy all the time. However, if they are being lazy all the time, then they are not going towards a golden mean, so they are probably acting immorally. In summary, virtue ethics is a character-centered ethical system whereby we should strive to be virtuous in our actions. Aristotle and Plato believed that the ultimate goal of living a virtuous life is to achieve eudaimonia, or human flourishing. Aristotle and Plato were also the forerunners of this ethical system, and debate continues today about what are the most important virtues. And lastly, virtue ethics contrasts with other normative theories in its holistic, character-centered approach.